continuing our our close Grisaille painting today. We got ourselves a nice setup last week. So really we're just gonna look at the brush strokes that we see and match them on our painting. One thing you'll notice is the thinned out paint down here is quite a bit warmer to it, whereas the top coats we're starting to put on are bluer looking. So this whole top painting is going to look bluish compared to what's underneath here. And that's just because white, as we've discussed before, is a very, very cool, almost bluish color. So we're going to have kind of two different temperatures. We call them color temperatures, warm versus cool on here. And that'll kind of mimic what we're seeing in our actual painting that we're copying, because that underpainting is so warm. I'm just going to continue with the pot that I see here, trying to get the value mixed up right. Yeah, it's too dark. Once I get the value mixed in the right area of where I'm going to work, I can start to get a little more specific with the texture of the brush work in here. So I'm kind of looking at this area right in here.
Are you looking to match the brushwork in the brush?
Yep. Once I zero in on the value here, well, that's too dark. It's too light, then it's too dark. That's a little too dark. And that actually does look like it gets built up to be pretty textural, but there is a few strokes underneath here. So that's a thinner stroke. That's right on there. You can actually see some of the claw marks of the brush on there. So I'm going to actually pick up a different brush here. This is a Rosemary extra long comber. It's kind of like the mongoose brushes, only the hairs are jagged and irregular, so it allows us to get a little more of that claw marky kind of texture to the stroke. Yeah. So you can see some of that underpainting showing through. So I highly recommend picking up some of these if you're going to be doing some paintings that are more direct, or even master copies that are more direct. Master copies are going to be the key to you learning how to paint. We mentioned that in drawing before, but in painting it's doubly important, because that's actually teaching you how to apply the paint, how thick, how thin to make it, what brushes to use and what size brushes to use in what instances. For some reason, the only people I really see doing master copies frequently of paintings tend to be professional artists. But the students wanting to learn how to paint, I never seem to see them doing many master copies. They all want to do their own paintings. But that alone should be a little clue if you're actually serious about getting good at your craft. And again, we've had lectures where we've talked about the Prix de Rome and things like that, where students have traveled to Italy and spent 3 or 4 years just doing master copies. That's nothing new, but for some reason we don't see a lot of students doing them. So I saw a little, there was a nice crisp edge on this side of the vase here, but so I needed a little more fluid of a medium to get that. And then just inside that crisp edge, I can see some transparent underpainting coming through. So I lay the stroke in and I can lift it back out, either with a brush or with a paper towel. It doesn't really matter. What you're going to need to try and learn to do in a situation like this, where you're beginning to study more intently the actual application of paint and trying to make the similar choices that the artist made, is that you're going to need to try and keep into an area here, because it doesn't matter quite as much how the overall painting was developed, whether or not Thayer did bounce all around the painting, but your task is to relate all of these values along with this paint application. So you need to actually study a little more intently how a group of brush strokes work together.
again and try again.
Oh, technology. So if you're the type of person who feels that compulsive need to jump all around the painting, you're going to have to dial that back. If you get bored and you want to leave, say, this area where I'm trying to resolve all of these layers matching what I see, then you just need to take a break, walk away, and come back. You know, I don't think people, for the most part, take enough breaks when they're painting. This is a very mentally consuming process that we're trying to do here, where you're getting everything to fit together like all these little puzzle pieces and have a certain textural effect. So if you're not committing all of the mental energy that you should be, then you probably will just go on forever. And that's sort of that whole mindless brushstroke sort of thing. So if you find that you can go for more than 15 or 20 minutes on a painting like this, then you're probably not doing it correctly. And you need to step back and begin to analyze again. And once you leave the academy at the end of the year, this is how you're going to learn to do paintings. And if you look at all the really good artists, you'll realize that they're doing the same thing. Anytime their style shifts, it's usually after they've done a master copy or two where they've studied a certain artist to see how the paint was laid down or the colors were interacting. I'm trying to think here when I'm laying into this, what is a color change versus a value change, and how do I do that? Anyone? What's that?
Well, squinting.
Squinting, yeah. If I squint and the strokes seem to blend together, it means that the values are relatively close together. Then I open my eye to see if it's actually softened to make them go together, or if it's actually broken brush strokes that's just the same value. In this case, it looks like it's scumbled on a little bit right there. There's a body stroke right next to it. I'm using some, I think, Gamblin's Galkit Slow Dry here to give my paint a little more fluidity.
So should we use a medium if we need that?
If you're doing a direct painting, you'll probably definitely need a medium. If you're working on maybe like the Alma Tadema, could probably be done without a medium. It doesn't look like there's really too much splishy splashy brush strokes in there. But yeah, you're going to have to analyze the painting and decide. Some may be as simple as just using an oil for a medium. Some you may need to get a little more fluid of a medium. You're going to have to just analyze the painting to see, in a case like this, how wash-like some of the areas are, how thin some of those brush strokes are. Those are all clues to the consistency of the paint. So after that, that's why we had the medium workshop before we actually got to this day. I wanted you to have the medium workshop before we begin to assess our master copy for all of these paint qualities, so that you can incorporate the necessary medium. And if you don't want to have a million different mediums at home, that's fine. That's why I encourage you to pick the artist that you like because of their brushwork, for example, and paint application, and then find a contemporary medium that will do the same effect as what they have done with their historical mediums. So this area is going to get quite a bit thicker in here. This area is going to get super thick right in there. But I do want to wait until I get to that super thick paint. If I lay it down and I haven't set up my more transparent areas underneath, then I'm going to basically have to scrape off the opaque paint, lay the transparent paint again, and then put the opaque paint back on top of it. So, the easiest paint to see in a master copy is when it's super thick. If it's a big impasto chunk, that's easy for us to pick up. So, you know, you're going to want to start there, but you have to slow down and try to extrapolate what's underneath.
How do you keep track of where you're at?
Well, the drawing that I have on here is fairly developed, actually. So it's pretty easy to work shape to shape to shape. Which is why I encouraged last week to spend as much time as possible developing that underpainting.
I was just thinking that Monet was so hard.
What's that?
I was thinking how hard the Monet was.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, there wasn't a whole lot of value shift in there. It was just little color spot next to little color spot next to little color spot. Paintings like that, if you're trying to replicate them more precisely, are, as far as the drawing, are quite a bit more challenging. You know, that's why for those color studies, I don't really care if you get the drawing correct on those. They're just intended to help you see color. And speaking of color, Mike Malm is teaching a workshop this week in room 1 right next to us. You may remember his work from those of you who did the color study of him, of Brittany, the painting of Brittany Martin. Yeah. So, do you have that painting with you by chance, Martin?
I don't.
Oh, darn. You can say you could wander over and show him. Tell him it was your first painting. He'd be honored. But yeah, he gets some really great color effects in his painting, so I do encourage you to go over and look at what he's doing there. So I can see in here little pieces of the brownish underpainting showing through. So when I do see those areas, I'm trying to leave little splotches like that peeking through. Now, because of the nature of the sort of loose painting that it is, you're not going to be able to mimic those exact little shapes of the speckles of the underpainting showing through. And that's not necessarily the goal. We mentioned this last week, but it'll be good to reiterate this as much as possible. The goal of this master copy is not to copy it to be like a photocopy. The goal is to copy it to look as if the same painter painted your painting. So even though some of the spontaneous or carefree strokes may be a little different, someone might look at your painting and say, oh yeah, this exhibits a lot of the same quality of brush work, that it looks like it could potentially have been done by the same artist. I need that more fluid. And that's kind of different from what we did with the drawing master copy. The point of the drawing master copy was for it to look like you just took it over to the office and made a photocopy of it. And just copy everything exactly as you see, spec for spec. But that was to train you to use the charcoal, to train you to do measurements, to train you to see values, etc., etc. This, we're assuming you know all that. And so we're training you to analyze and mimic brushwork. Notice how I'm varying sometimes how I'm holding my brush. It's not always this, right? Sometimes I pull a stroke, sometimes I flick a stroke, sometimes I scrub a stroke. You need to be able to have an understanding of how to make a variety of brush marks with your brush. This would be a good time to pull out that brush stroke chart, because you're going to need to select sections of that chart that you're going to want to use in your master copy here. So if you turn in your final master copy that you've done at home, and you've got the drawing correct, and the colors are pretty good, but you failed to get any of this brushwork in there, it's not a successful master copy.
When should we be starting to work on that?
Well, now that you've had some some experience with color via our color lecture classes, you can probably start on that now. We're going to begin our in-class color master copy in a couple weeks here. So that was the original intent. That would give you 4 weeks to do a painting, which is plenty of time to do a painting of this size. But yeah, you can go ahead and start early. And I highly encourage everyone to do multiple master copies. I don't want you to stop at the one. You should be doing master copies all the time. I'll bring in some of the master copies that I've done when we get to the color section. So I can see one stroke right in here. It's got 3 splayed claw marks on there. So I know it needs to be fluid enough to make marks like that with a thinner brush like this rosemary one here. So I add some medium, I splay it thusly, make sure it's nice and fluid. I need to get, so this medium's a little thick actually, thicker than what I'm used to. So I'm gonna put a little thinner in it, there we go. This would be a case where it'd be really nice to be utilizing the Meyer medium, because then I would really control the fluidity of the medium to match the painting that I'm copying. So if you get in the habit of mixing that, you'll probably be in pretty good shape. That was a little too regular of a stroke. I'm going to wipe it off and try again. And that's a good lesson too. You should never be afraid to wipe off your stroke and try it again. One of the reasons why Sargent's paintings look the way they do is because he would paint a nose, sometimes a dozen or 20 times, and keep wiping it off and wiping it off and wiping it ooff and wiping it off until he painted it the one time where it looked carefree and accurate. So if that's the effect you're trying to go for, then you need to not be afraid to wipe off a stroke. There we go, something like that, to match that one there. And then we'll lighten it up on top, like that. Feed it into the rest of the area there. In my own paintings, I typically like smoother areas for the focus, and then I want areas in the peripheral to be very loose and suggested. So when I get to those areas, a lot of times it's a back and forth. I lay the stroke down, I don't like it, I wipe it off. I lay it down, I wipe it off. I lay it down, I wipe it off. And when we're talking about brushwork, there's not really a right and wrong to brushwork. I mean, you can have an accurate painting where every stroke is uniform in direction. You know, a lot of Edgar Payne stuff is like that too. All of the brush marks are just like vertical dabs or horizontal dabs or whatever, just repeated, 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 and the painting still comes out nice. But certainly the brush stroke lends a feeling to the work that you don't get if they're all the same. And it's, you know, some people refer to it as the signature of the artist, or the personality of the artist even. Your personality will show through in your brushwork. And from speaking with collectors and galleries and things like that, you know, there's some people who like a painting primarily for the brushwork. So it's certainly something to consider. Whether or not you decide to have a variety of brushwork is completely up to you. But as an artist, typically you'll find that you become more enamored with various different brush applications that you may end up wanting to put into your own work. So there's a spot of thin underpainting showing there, and there's a thicker piece of lighter value. So I'm looking here, and I can see underpainting here, and that's actually a thicker stroke next to it. But they're a similar value. So from a distance, they read almost the same. Still not lighting up. The thicker strokes you'll find tend to be a little easier to get because if it's not right, you can just pick up more paint and modify it on there, especially with a Grisaille like this. With color, it's a little more tricky, but still the same kind of idea. But with thin strokes, you'll notice that you have to continually wipe off and retry and wipe off and retry. So if you went to the Scott Burdick demo, that was really interesting to see because, if something wasn't right or you needed to modify it, just picks up a big old shovel of paint and then just throws it on and keeps manipulating it until it's correct. And then he gets that big, thick, juicy impasto look in all of his paintings. But then you look at his wife, Sue, and she's more delicate and sort of dances around the shape and value until she finally feels that it's right before laying it down. So their paintings have a very different quality to them. It's a little thinner. Kind of doing a little check to make sure everything's looking all right. I'm getting closer to laying that impasto on. So I just want to make sure I give myself a nice setup here to do that. For the color master copy, I think I'm going to be doing the Alma Tadema of the girl reclining on the bench. So the paint application is going to be very, very different. It's a different buildup. It's starting with a really dark underpainting on a very textured canvas, and there's some scraping involved. And not a whole lot in the flesh tone of this sort of work. But then you go and you look at some of the other areas of the painting, and some of this does show through. So there is quite a bit of variety in that one. And then you look at something like the Friant copy, and that face is tiled on and smoothed out and built up, and then the actual background is just very, very thin. Now, if you want, you can modify your black here with a little burnt sienna or burnt umber if you want to make it a little warmer, like the underpainting. That'll just make it more of a consistent color. But it's totally up to you. If you decide to do that, I am going to encourage you to make a lot of that color so that it's consistent all the way throughout the painting. You don't want to get this with too much variety of different colors. So I just went for that stroke right there. One nice clean stroke with hard edges on both sides. And then it fades into this slightly thinner paint over on the right. And then there's going to be a thick opaque stroke right above that. Okay, so it's there. To look close to make sure I don't get fooled by what's underpainting and what's overpainting. Has everybody completed the brushstroke chart? Did you guys bring it today?
When you get
Well, if you didn't bring it, you just can't use it, so that's all. I would probably recommend bringing it next week.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of like the color charts. If you don't have the brushstroke chart with you, then you are not going to be able to really use it. while you're working. So one of the reasons for taking a break also that we just had is to allow for some of this to set up just a little bit, because I am wanting to do some more opaque strokes on here, which means I'm going to need this to be a little bit tacky, so hopefully it's set up a little bit so that I can lay some of this on here. But I want to look and see how thick some of that stuff is in there, and it's somewhat thick, but not as thick as the really, really opaque guys that I'm going to lay right in the center of that. So you'll probably find as well with an exercise like this that if your drawing skills aren't as strong, then master copies of figure paintings are very, very hard. Because if we're trying to copy the color and we're trying to copy the brushwork and you're struggling over the drawing, you're going to lose all of this brushwork because you're trying to make the drawing look correct. So if you're trying to learn a lot of this really spontaneous brushwork especially, I recommend utilizing a still life or a landscape to where you don't have to struggle too much on that color, on the drawing. Let's see. Getting a stiffer bristle brush here for some more opaque paint. The comber and even the badger brush is just not heavy, stiff enough to be able to really get some impasto work going on in here. So this first color is not as impasto, so I'm gonna start with the less impasto stuff first, and then build up to the thicker paint off to the sides here. Ooh, a little too soon. Whoa, not quite right. So this I'm wanting to knock down a little bit to get to some of these mid-value areas in here that I'm looking at. They should be just a little bit darker than the underpainting. My underpainting may have even gotten a little too dark in that area. I would have liked it a little lighter.
You could have lifted more paint out from the underpainting before you applied this.
Maybe, yeah, I probably could have. But it's still, you know, if I did that, it's more likely to just strip it off completely. I could come in here a little bit. Yeah, something like that. That's actually what I need. That makes more sense. You guys see the underpainting on the reference that I'm looking at? Mm-hmm. That really warm stuff in there? Yeah. I want to get that value a little more precise here.
Tim, can you tell when someone's done the impasto with a brush versus a knife? Is there a telltale sign?
The brush impasto tends to be a little more irregular and have tracks in it. Impasto with a knife typically doesn't have as much of the track, the claw marks. It can be smoother or it can just be lumped on there. It just won't be as likely to have the kind of streaky stuff going through it. Okay, that's about right. Okay, yeah, now it's time to start getting thicker. Thick, thick, thick. This is where the stiff paint's really going to come into play if you have stiff paint. If you don't have stiff paint, you're going to have to make sure that you really are not using thinner for this section here. It's a little too light. And watch what I do on the palette here. You know, lower this so we can see. as I mix this paint and I get closer to the value I think it needs to be, right? See how it's all spread out in this larger section? Then I'll start pushing it all together towards the center and build up a significant amount of paint on the brush. And then I can use that to lay down my stroke. Like that. So that's how I'm going to approach all of this impasto on here, especially because these are relatively small marks. So I don't need to get super, super thick. I don't need to really pile the paint on. I can just mix it as I normally do and then scrape it together and then lay on these little tiny marks here. And you're gonna have to remember that how you're holding the brush is going to largely impact your success here. If you're doing all of your brush work like this, you're not going to be able to lay wet paint on top of wet paint. You're going to have to lay the paint on gingerly, as if you're drawing on eggshells, just gently. And we practice this a lot with drawing. The way you were, well, if you were holding your pencil the way I instructed you to hold your pencil and did all the things I instructed you to do with drawing, now that's all going to pay off. If you didn't, then this is going to be quite the challenge for you. So I can see a mark here, some slightly more impasto that I'm going to have to lay down on the more towards the side here. And what I can extrapolate by looking at the reference is that the edges are harder and the paint is thicker towards the top of the stroke, and then it dissipates and melts into the paint underneath at the bottom. So I know that I'm starting my stroke at the top, and then I'm dragging it down, and I'm relieving the pressure as I go down to help it melt into the rest of it. So I can see all that just by looking for the characteristic ridges. I wonder if I have a smaller brush. I think this is my smallest bristle that I have here. Let me see this guy maybe. I'm gonna try this guy. He's a little stiffer, so it'll be better for a smaller section here. Anchor my hand, come in from the corner, thicker on the top, and then gently sort of drag it into the bottom there. Got a couple along the side here, sort of similar, a little darker. In all cases it looks like coming down. If you don't have enough paint on your brush, you'll notice that your edges are too soft. And actually when I laid that stroke, my edge was a little too soft at top, meaning my paint wasn't thick enough. So I can come back like that. That's what I needed to do. But that's the wrong value. So I'll come back in here. If I adjust it too much, I might lose my hard edge. So I have to be careful. The right side of this is not quite as hard. There, something like that. And now I'll start building up some of the thicker stuff. So I have to think with each stroke that I see, where did it start and where did it end? Based off of your brush stroke charts, you should be able to sort of see some of the characteristic hardness or softness on the left side of the stroke or the right side of the stroke. So you'll know which side you're supposed to start and end on. You'll be able to see variations in pressure that you may have applied to create buildup of the paint. In the case of this, there's a stroke here where there's it's a curled stroke, and there's a little more paint on the right side of that, so there may have been a little more pressure at the center, so it's kind of laid in like this. So we'll try to do something like that. It's a loaded broken color stroke, which is a little tough to mimic, especially in a situation like this, because the one I'm looking at here is this little guy right in here, and it's sort of a medium value, and then a lighter value, and then a dark value, and then a really light value, where the paint filled up on the edge all in one stroke. So that's most likely going to be impossible for me to mimic in a situation like this. So I'm just going to focus on the general color or value of that stroke, and then try to get the paint laid down in a similar way. So something like, check my value here. Yeah, it's probably a good value. Like that. Aha, I got it. See that little arc there? To mimic the arc that he's got on there. The stroke is not as loaded as his, so I don't have the variety. We've mentioned how difficult that broken color can be to replicate. It's something that you're going to have to. I'm sure it's something that wasn't actually even in the original pot, but it had enough interest and variety that we could leave it and be happy with it. Let's lay in some other stuff here. We got a really thick, gnarly stroke right there. And then a slightly darker one right here leading up. It might be a little too dark. So notice how long I'm spending on some of these, thinking about the stroke and trying to get the right value correct, trying to get the right paint load, selecting the right brush. This is what you need to be thinking about every stroke. That's why painting is so thought involving, so mentally complex, if we're doing it correctly. Okay. That is a little too light. Let's see if I can scrape it off here. That, good. Maybe a little more. To get that stroke right there. Just building it up, building it up. You'll notice Impasto has a nice tendency to pick up all the available light from an area. So in the case of the strokes that I'm about to make here, these two top light strokes, they're almost the same value as the under painting. But if we were to see this painting in person, those highlights would appear lighter because they stand out from the canvas, they pick up a little more light. So it's a nice way to optically foil two of the same values against each other. It's too much paint. It's a little too light. Not much, just a little. Something like that. There we go. Another one. Ooh, it looks like he went the other way. You have to go from right to left.
Certainly not making it easy for you.
Certainly not. Yeah. And you know, left or right-handedness is something you can probably tell of the artist if you look at the direction of the strokes that they're typically doing. But that should not inhibit you from limiting your strokes to one direction. No, that needed to be, that was probably a palette knife application. I think I brought one down here. You didn't make it. That's all right. I'll hit that one next week. I'll bring a palette knife down. Just erase this out. The thinness of that stroke makes me think that it was most likely not done with a brush. So I'm just going to soften that out into the surrounding areas of paint. And then next week, we'll lay it on a little thicker. what you'll notice about painting is that if you spend an appropriate amount of time thinking, you'll spend a lot less time fixing. While painting like this may appear very slow and tedious, ultimately it gets faster and faster and faster and faster, and then more accurate painting will be accomplished much more quickly than if I were to just get so eager to cover the canvas that I lay it all in. And it's funny because people who don't watch me paint think I'm a very fast painter. And people who do watch me paint think I'm a very slow painter. Because I'll have a painting and say, you know, oh, this took 3 hours to do. And it's, wow, you got a lot done in 3 hours and it looks so accurate. But if you were watching me paint, it's mix, 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 study, mix, 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 study, lay a stroke on. So it's very, very tedious. And you know, this sort of method of painting is certainly not appropriate for everyone. It depends on your mentality. If you get bored or have ADD, then you know you're going to be bouncing all over the place. And that's certainly fine. There's lots of painters who paint like that. It's just you have to understand that and not be trying to do something like this if that's your mentality for painting. You know, certainly a lot of the Chinese guys work in such a way that they kind of bounce all around, block everything in, fairly uniform brush strokes, and at the end of the day scrape it down and build it up the next day and sort of bounce all over. And that's perfectly legitimate method of painting, but you have to understand that your painting won't look something like this by the end of it. It's going to have a very different look to it. So don't fit a, you know, they say a round peg into a square hole. If your personality is not to be slow and thoughtful, then don't do a lot of paintings that are slow and thoughtful. You should still, though, you know, in a master copy, that is the purpose, is to, you know, get into the shoes and get into the head of the painter. So you're going to need to some degree, mimic a lot of the stuff. But let your painting mimic your personality. You'll be much happier in the end of it. Ooh, there's a nice stroke right up there on the lid of the pot that I want to try and get. That's good. We have a few minutes left here today. I'm just going to set myself up for next week.
Will we be working on this next week?
You will, yeah. You get this week and next week. So you have a total of 4 more hours on this painting. So again, I'm not expecting a whole lot done, but what is done I would like to be relatively accurate. So, like we just said, if you end up bouncing around because that's kind of how the painter you're copying did it, that's okay, but don't bounce around so much that you don't get anything finished. If that makes sense. A little bit lighter over here and a little thicker too. One of the tricky things with impasto that you won't run into now because it's black and white, but you'll run into with color, is students tend to be totally fine with dumping huge amounts of white into their paint to make it nice and thick, but they get nervous when it comes to dumping more expensive colors into their paint to get something impasto. Like expensive colors like cadmium. You know, if you're working in a cadmium red and cobalt blue, which is also kind of pricey, and a cadmium yellow, which is also kind of pricey, you know, it might be like $1 for that stroke that you're going to lay on there. So that's why students get, you know, kind of scared sometimes to lay in the impasto in color. So keep that in mind as you decide on your painting style that you want to migrate towards. It's not as bad with the limited palette painting that we're going to do, but if you do want to move to a full palette painting and you want to be an impasto painter, then I don't want you to see you fluffing out your puddle mixture with just extra white. It's not a good habit. Oops, that stroke was too thick. Let's see if I can get some dark down here in the bottom. Should be able to get the rim painted in as well. Gets nice and dark down there. So there's one fairly body stroke of dark paint, and then the rest of that dark paint is thinned with a bit of medium. One way you can see that it's medium thinned as opposed to dry brushed on is the quality of the edge of the stroke. If you've noticed with your brush stroke chart, one with medium that's more fluid will have crisper edges around the side. One that's more of a dry brush will have more deckled edge. Even body paint will tend to have a little more broken of an edge than paint thinned with medium. So by looking at this stroke, for example, and I see that it's crisp on both sides, it's most likely, since it's not impasto, that there was some sort of medium to make the paint more fluid. So that's a little bit of deductive reasoning. That's too dark. It's too light. And this one is just right. Got that crisper edge there because of the medium. You'll also notice too, which you couldn't really tell with the brush stroke chart, but if you try to use thinner as your medium at this stage, instead of getting a crisp edge, it'll strip out the paint underneath it and actually make it a softer edge. So you have to make sure you're paying attention to those layers as you do this. And if you need medium, we do have some. Even down here, medium stroke, right at the bottom there. It actually looks like this light stroke that's underneath the pot is more of an opaque stroke. So I'll probably hit that in later as I get towards the finish. This shadow does tend to get more and more transparent at the bottom of it down here, allowing some of that underpainting to show through. So I've got to thin that out a little bit. And that was a little too thick. There we go. Some of that underpainting speckling through. Some of these effects, I don't know if you guys can even see from back there. I can see how that I made that shadow transparent by lifting some paint off. To you, it might not even have affected the look of the paint at all.
Did you lift it off with just the brush?
The brush,
Or no
yeah.
medium? No.
Well, it was a brush stroke with medium, but it was too opaque, so I had to lift a little bit of it off to expose some of the underpainting, like in the reference. It's a little thicker here. That's a claw mark. I need to get that claw mark. So to get a claw mark texture, jamming my brush into the palette, letting it splay out. This is the mongoose one, so it's a little fuller. I might need to actually switch to the comb. These extra long combs are destined to be super popular. And the nice thing is they're not going to be as expensive as all the other ones because it's like half the hair. And it's synthetic hair too. So the cost of the brush is going to be really affordable. Yeah, there we go. That's perfect. Perfect. The right tools will do wonders. I want to get that little bit of paint scratched out in here to show some of that underpainting. Maybe even a little more. Just using the back of the brush there. That'll be a technique you'll use if you need to do some like writing and things like that. Or designs on clothing. That works really well.
So Tim, can you show me on the reference material where you were use copying to put the claw mark in at the bottom, because
Oh, yeah, and again, you might not be able to see it from where you're at. You might have to get a little closer. Down here was a stroke. It just looks like there's 3 or 4 little lines stroked across there. There are a few other areas I've done it as well. And this, unfortunately, this is a slightly more textured canvas. So the more textured your canvas is, the more it's going to break up the look of those claw marks in there. You know, normally I work on a very fine weave portrait linen. So all of those little individual claw marks show up, but something like over here, you know, it's definitely got that streaky look, but because it's such a textured canvas, it breaks it up to make it look more like noise, just sort of almost stippling. Okay, we're going to set up. Oh, I wanted to get, there's a couple similar claw marks pulling into the background. Now I probably need some more background painted in there, but that's okay. I'll see if I can just lay it down for now. It's the same sort of thing. I'm jamming my comber into the palette, and then I'll just pull it straight through. See that? So there's 2 big ones there and 3 thin ones there in that one mark.
Does it look like it's on top of that background though? So how do you know when to put the dark down? And
Yeah, well, like I just said, it looks like there was some background painted in there already, so I'm probably going to have to go back and do it, but this is a good way to show you the claw mark effect. Something like that. Jam it on in there. There we go. And like that. Even down here. And that sort of claw mark swoop you'll see in a lot of paintings is a great way to actually kind of soften an edge into another area of paint. Even something that you wouldn't normally expect to see that done with. So just like the edge of that pot, you wouldn't normally think to take something that's very geometric and cylindrical like that and just break up that mechanical curve with a stroke like that. But it's a common trick that a lot of painters use, historically and contemporary. And when you step back, it just sort of melts away into just sort of a softened edge, and you don't notice it as much. Especially when you get the 2 values like in the reference. The 2 values are really close together. Since I haven't painted the background, you know, it really stands out as being obvious. But if I had painted the background in first and done that, you probably wouldn't even see those claw marks there because it just naturally blends away so much. But if you look at paintings like by Dan Keyes, he does it all the time in lots of his paintings. And you would be looking at an orange and being like, wait, there's no claw stroke leading away from that orange into the flowers. I don't understand where that came from. But when you step back, it just all optically blends together. So, you know, we're creating an illusion on here, an optical illusion, much like M.C. Escher, where we're just sort of tricking people into thinking that what we're painting is believable. And most artists find that the most interesting paintings are those that, when you look closer, you find there's no way something in reality could look like that, because it's just a bunch of little abstract marks. And some people find the more the line is danced between abstract mark making and realism, in general, more people tend to respond to it because, you know, everybody can like an abstract painting because there's no content into it. So if you make your paint application kind of that abstract orientation here with all this little stuff to look at, then even somebody who doesn't necessarily like flowers can come up and be like, oh wow, look at all that paint there and those marks there and all that. You can appreciate it on a different level, a more purely aesthetic level than just being what the subject is. So anytime you start to migrate in that direction, you can break down those barriers a little bit. Okay. So we're almost done here. Just getting my last couple strokes. I want to set up this pot to be painted next week here. Okay, oops, yeah, that's okay. All right, yeah, that's good.
So is that ideal to wait that long before you apply the next area? of paint?
Oh, that's a good question. It depends on the medium that you use. So if you're using a completely new medium, you need to figure out what the setup time is. If you're using like Gamsol as your underpainting, you'll find it's like 10 to 15 minutes, and then the paint has set up enough for you to start to be able to lay stuff on top of it without scraping it off. But you can't be noodling the same area for 15 minutes. You have to leave it and then come back 15 minutes later and work. So that's why if you guys are never taking a break, you're working over the whole painting over and over and over again, then it's never going to get set up. So you have to leave an area and then go to the next area, and then 15 minutes later you go back and work on it. The Ralph Meyer medium that I like to use goes between 15 and 25 minutes or so, and then I can start laying on top of that. But I usually don't need to lay too much on top of that. It would just be my impasto stroke. So lay it down with the mineral spirit, wait 15 minutes or so, go on top of it with the Meyer medium, and then if I need some impasto, wait another 15 or 20 minutes, and then lay those finishing strokes on. So if you end up going to Open Studio, you have to figure out the timing, because that's really important. If you don't understand the timing that the oil paint sets up in, then you're going to have a really hard time progressing through the painting. You're always going to be stuck at the mineral spirit stage. So what I like to do is sort of draw out an area in the first 25 minutes the model's up there. It's usually just drawing out the where I'm placing everything, boxing it up, and then starting to lay in the initial drawing, and then we take a break, and then we come back after the break, and on top of that initial drawing, I'm beginning to start layering in some paint with medium, and then about 15 minutes into it, I stop that and then go and start to draw out the next section, so that we go on break and then come back, and then I can finish touching up the original area I painted and then move on to the area that I just drawn, and then stop 15 minutes there and go and start to draw the next. So you figure out the timing to be able to lay the paint on, but that will depend on your medium.